Okay, in the middle of the 1990s, I was working at the University of Tromsø as the chair of the Department of English. And while I was the chair of the Department of English, there were some guys in the library who got a really crazy idea. And that idea was that they would build an electronic archive, an electronic repository, and they would use that as a tool for distributing theses that were written at the University of Tromsø. In fact, they would do even something crazier than that. They would also use it as a tool for submitting, for gathering theses that were written at the University of Tromsø. And they were looking for guinea pigs. They were looking for departments that were willing to try out their ideas. So they talked to several of us who were chairs. I talked to a few of my colleagues. I talked to a few of the students. And we thought this would be an interesting thing to do. So we signed on to be part of a pilot project for something which subsequently has turned into the University of Tromsø's open archive, which we call Munnen. So we started requiring our students to submit their master's theses through this electronic archive. And most of the students thought this was a very cool thing to do. They thought they were on the cutting edge. They were part of the next generation, and that was being totally clear by getting rid of paper and turning everything in on this archive, and it would just magically appear on not only your teacher's desk, but someplace that anybody in the world could find it. Most of the students thought like that. There were a couple of students. There was one student in particular who really strongly resisted this idea. And as it was getting closer and closer to the day that he would submit his thesis, his resistance got stronger and stronger. He was definitely not going to take his hard work and put it out there on this weird amorphous web thing for anyone to get a hold of. So I tried to talk to him, and I tried to understand what his concerns were, and ultimately he dressed them up as plagiarism. It seemed to me it was just some kind of general fear of anything new. And in fact, it was a failure to realize that one of the best ways to fight plagiarism is to put your stuff on the web. But that was an early time, and that kind of argument wasn't really understood there. In fact, this guy actually refused to have a paper copy of his thesis in the library. But that was an early attempt. That archive was an early attempt at making research results easily and widely available, the open archive approach. But it shows us something about trying to implement change in academia. It shows us, for one thing, that the slowness of adopting change isn't unique to faculty members. Students also can be extremely conservative. In fact, that's the whole problem that we face, right, is pervasive conservatism. For me, this story illustrates maybe the first of very many examples of failed leadership on my part. I had a goal. I was absolutely sure that it would be better for this guy to follow me where I was trying to take him, and I couldn't get him to come along. In the summer of 2002, I had the pleasure with 4 of my colleagues of getting some very exciting news, namely that we would have the opportunity to start a center of excellence. And at the end of that year, I started working as the head of this center. And one of the things I had to do was hire a bunch of people at all levels, PhD students, postdocs, also faculty members. I'm actually proud to report that I managed to recruit somebody from Oxford to come and join us. That was a very exciting thing to do. I had to get those new people to come to the center and try and get them on board with the heavy lifting that we were trying to do. The most important thing we had to do in those first few years was to try to make our mark internationally. And the product that we could use to make our mark was our research. There was something that happened with one of my colleagues that was a huge shock to me that I never could have anticipated and completely failed to handle in a sensible way. What happened was that I had hired a guy who had recently finished a dissertation, who had shown himself to be the next brilliant, earth-shattering, big thinker in my field. He had accepted, he had come to Tromsø, and he didn't write a thing. It's not just that he didn't publish, he didn't even write. And that was really fascinating to me. Now, in the first years that you have a center of excellence, there's really one thing that you think about, and that is that 4 years later you're going to be evaluated. And in our particular case, there were about 60 million kroner riding on that evaluation. And we knew that our publication record was going to be a big part of the evaluation. So I needed everybody to get on board with this, and I couldn't move this guy at all. It wasn't just that he wasn't publishing, he was in principle opposed to publishing. He thought that was the wrong thing for someone in his, with his stature to do. He didn't always say that quite so explicitly. He would say things to me like, well, my theory isn't ready. He would say things like, I haven't checked the data enough. I'm concerned that my work will be criticized by people who don't understand it. Also, my ideas might get stolen. Another thing he said one time was that, well, Chomsky's getting to be an old guy and it wouldn't be very nice to sort of take him down at that age. So there were all sorts of reasons that he had for not publishing. Now, this is basically a rejection of one of the most basic premises of science, namely that results should be shared, both as a kind of quality control, but also to be built on by others in our international research community. So suppose we could label the presumption of sharing results as the presumption of open research, right? New knowledge should be made available to everyone. This story, for me, shows a number of things. One of the things it shows is that even in the context of research, which is one of the most demanding creative activities that anyone engages in, you can meet someone who is, on the one hand, incredibly creative, because he definitely is, on the other hand, incredibly conservative. It turns out, in fact, that there's a correlation between publishing and publishing. It goes like this. People who publish a lot always publish a lot, and people who don't publish anything never publish anything. Behavior is really conservative. And for me, this was yet another in a string of failures of leadership. I could not figure out how to get this fellow to change. And I was sure that his career would be better if he would get on board with what I was trying to do. And I'm still sure of that. And I still didn't manage to do it. A third and final story here. I have recently become the chair of the board for something that's called Kristin, which stands for Current Research Information Systems in Norway, which is the successor to FRIDAB, which is, among other things, our way of registering research production in Norway. One of the responsibilities that Kristin has is to implement the government's and the research council's policies on open access, right? And you all know what open access publishing is about, I guess, right? So traditional publishing, you give your stuff to the journal and then your library buys it back. In open access publishing, you pay the journal to publish your stuff and your library and everyone else on the planet gets it for free. So it's a change fundamentally in the way that we provide access to research results. And it's motivated by a laudable ideal, namely that everyone should be able to get access to the work of researchers, independent of how wealthy their library might be. On the part of researchers, at least researchers in the West, there's massive resistance to using open access publishing. Researchers are convinced that the quality can't possibly be as good as it is in traditional journals. At least researchers who have never been the editor of a traditional journal are convinced of that. Because the reputation of open access journals is lower, those publications tend not to count as much, we fear, when it comes time for things like promotion or giving grants. And which is one of the main reasons that we can be bothered to publish at all. Furthermore, the author pay model creates complications, right? It used to be clear that the library would pay to buy the journal. But now that I have to pay on the way in, who does that, right? Does the library pay on the way in for me? Do I bill that to my grant? How does that work out? So there's all sorts of resistance to open access. I happen to think that open access is a step towards even better models of publishing, especially when it comes to quality control. So I try to argue against these positions, and I've already been doing that some in this new position I have, and I already find myself thinking about how to get people on board, and I already see in great big letters on that wall over there the word failure. I'm not yet sure how to do it, but I have some ideas. So think about all the places in which we meet the term open these days. I just mentioned 3 of them: open archive, open research, open access. We just heard one in the last lecture, open spires, I think it was. Open source in software. In industry, people talk about open innovation. In some places, we talk about open courseware. Right? It's the age of open. It's new, it's exciting, it's radical, and it's destined to meet massive resistance. The age of open requires thinking in totally new ways about a lot of issues. For example, intellectual property and intellectual property rights. Who owns those podcasts? When iTunes starts charging money for them, who gets that money? The stories that I told you just now are stories from early points in the age of open. They're stories about change, they're stories about risk, they're stories about science, about taking a chance. They're stories about massive conservatism. And for me, they're stories about failure of leadership, my own failure of leadership. They're stories about trying to figure out how to get someone to change and failing.